Okay, good afternoon. We will start the session of this afternoon, and I invite to Professor Francesco Errico, who is going to launch this session.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Let me say first that it is a great pleasure to be here, and I thank also on the behalf of my co-presenter, the organizer of this meeting, for inviting me to give a talk. I welcome the Silk Road Initiative because I see it as an invitation to think out of the box and try to identify very broad questions and try to tackle them with a new, cognitive toolkit. So I will try during this presentation to identify some of these broad questions and also build on research that I'm doing or have done in the past, mostly with Chinese colleagues, and also try to suggest some direction for the future. Sorry, things go on. So I see that my slide go. Okay, so I think that something that gather all of us here is that we are all interested in culture, in human culture, cultural evolution, in a changing climatic setting. Culture can be defined as a threat or a set of traits that are transmitted by social learning, which means learning from others. Asocial learning, which is learning by trial and error, also exists, and has been very important to produce innovation. But without social learning, there is no culture. We know now that culture, defined as such, is not a human feature. It's something that many species in nature have culture, particularly chimpanzee, but also bird, orcas, dolphin, etc. And another key feature that I want to underline here is that culture is largely independent from genetic inheritance. So very similar cultural trait can develop in different regions, and this trait can also cross boundary and cross population boundary, but in the past also boundary between different human type, different genotypic type. We will give just two examples of that. For example, the Acheulean, we have been mentioned this morning. The Acheulean emerged in Africa 1.7 million years ago, arrived in Europe 700,000 years ago, in China 800,000 years ago, but persisted in Africa until 130,000 years ago in area that was largely already inhabited by modern sapiens. So we cannot equate a human type with a culture. The same happened with the Levallois that allow you to predetermine the morphology of flake, point, and blade. Perhaps emerged in Africa 350,000 years ago, but spread very, very quickly. Neanderthal used Levallois, modern human used Levallois, perhaps also Denisovan used Levallois, and clearly Neanderthal in Asia. What makes a human different in many respects from other animal species is the fact that we are the only one that have developed a cumulative culture. So the culture that allow us to accumulate skill, innovation in time. And we also see that in some cases, this accumulation is just the repurposing for different function of innovation that was already existing, something that in a number of papers we have called the cultural exaptation. It has been proposed that there are at least two types of cumulative culture. A cumulative culture type 1, which is just optimize a cultural trait using existing natural phenomenon, and a type 2 that expand the set of natural phenomena that we exploit. There are important consequences on whether we use a type 1 or a type 2. The type 1 can optimize a cultural trait, but you cannot increase them, improve them forever. While in fact the type 2 is one that potentially generate continuous improvement, create combinatorial opportunities, foster cultural diversity, and clearly create collaborative network. So a big question that I think is relevant for the Silk Road Initiative is when cumulative cultural evolution develop in human evolution, and also particularly when the type 2 emerge. And this is particularly important because it has been proposed, for example, by Richardson and Boyd, that cumulative cultural evolution has been an answer for the dramatic large amplitude climate change eroding at the middle upper Pleistocene transition. So in this case, human would have been the only species facing those challenging by accumulating knowledge and skill, and not just facing this evolution with organic evolution or just by tracking their ecological footprint. So this is really, I think, is a quick question that we should need to address. I will make a quick example of that and how this could be tackled, which is the origin of clothing. We know that hominin in Africa, with this genetic evidence suggests that hominin in Africa lost their fur and changed the color of their skin to adapt to a savanna environment. This process probably was already done by 2 million years ago. And then, but the need for protection from cold and wind only arose probably with the first out of Africa occurring between 2 million and 1.5 million years ago. We don't have any archaeological evidence of how this happened. But we know that by 800, 500,000 years ago, we have archaeological evidence suggesting that, in fact, humans were collecting and recovering skin. And then after 380,000, we have in the indication of use of a bone tool, most often a rib, to treat the skin. And the genetic evidence suggested that there was a split between the body lice and the head lice, indicating that after 170, 130,000 years ago, these creatures were comfortably living between our skin and our clothes. And then around 100,000 years ago, we start having the first bone holes in South Africa. But a type 2 cumulative cultural evolution occurred in Asia around 40,000 years ago, where we find the first eyed needles. Eyed needles are a cumulative culture because they use both a thread and a point. In Europe, we don't have this high needle until 26,000 years ago, and we have unpublished evidence showing that this was not an independent invention in Europe, but it was coming from Asia. And after that, we have an optimization, so a type 1 with this object. The eye needle become, both in Asia and in Europe, more and more thinner. They become thinner, but also they become more diversified in their shape, probably not just to make tailored clothes, but also to make underwear and also to sew ornament on the clothes of Upper Paleolithic people. Another issue that I want to touch upon is the issue of niche construction. So our species is well known for expanding its niche in a very effective way. But, but the niche is not an area occupied by the species. It's not a number of ecosystems occupied by the species. But the definition of niche ecologically, in one species is able to exert a selective pressure on other species by driving their own evolution and his own evolution. So the question is, when in human evolution we were not just a host in an environment, but we were able to have an impact on other species in a detectable way that have driven their evolution. And this is quite interesting. Very often modern humans are seen as the invasive species that is invading all the continent, but we compare the area occupied by different human types and compare that with climatic variability. In fact, we see that other hominins have done quite a good job at 75% of the exposed land were already colonized by other humans. Modern humans were quite good to occupy Americas and very high latitude and remote island, but most in terms of occupying region was already done by other hominins. So it's really something that we should investigate. But humans are not only those that have created the cumulative culture. We have created a very special niche that we can call an epistemic niche. So in fact, we are able to, unlike our species, we are able to create not only physical tool and innovation, but also cognitive tool. So these tools do more than change the environment. They change the way we think. In fact, they change the way our brain function. And they also change, of course, they have a feedback effect on the construction of this epistemic niche. So we are the only one. Of course, examples are, the computer, your mobile phone, but when you go back in time, rock art, Paleolithic notation, etc., are members of the element of this. So in a recent paper, we have proposed criteria to identify epistemic niche and explain in what they are different from a normal niche. I don't go into that, otherwise I will explode my time. But we have, after applied these criteria to 3 epistemic dimensions, which are the structuring of space, not only the inside space, the space inhabited by people, but also the outside space, the way in which people establish a network and connection with other groups. The culturalization of the body, which is the long process by which we transform our body in a cultural object, and the external information storage, starting with the first engravings, but moving to clearly writing and numerical system and so on. So we see that there is a chronology in these culturalization, different epistemic dimension, with the structuring of the space coming first, body culturalization coming later, and then information storage. But it's a process that starts 500,000 years ago. So just I will mention the two of these, some few examples. So we know that ochre, for example, yellow pigment is used in Africa. We have now more than 80 sites in Africa. From 500,000 to 40,000 years ago, we see the use of pigment. In Africa, we have now a database of more than 40 sites with pigment used between 380,000 and 40,000 years ago. And then we moved to the first shell bead used in Africa starting 160,000 years ago. In Africa, after 55,000 ostrich egg shell bead. And then we have in Eurasia, after 45,000, an explosion of bead types that are those characteristic of the Upper Paleolithic. But in Asia, the evidence is still scant. So we, apart from two sites, one from India and another from Australia, we have very few evidence for an old use of ochre, probably because at many sites in the past, ochre have not been recovered. Some of the, I've been lucky enough to study some of these cases. We have, for example, the site of Xama Bay, in which we were able to identify ochre, and also ochre processing tool is a 43,000 site. Now we have another site, the Yawai Dong, who is currently under publication by Professor Aoli, in which we have a long sequence from starting 43,000 years ago. We have identified tiny residue of ochre rich in hematite in some engraved bone found at a 120,000 years old site, Linjing, where we also have human remain, probably Denisovan. And about personal ornament, it's quite interesting to see that in China we have two different bead traditions. One is quite similar to what we find in Siberia and Europe, with many animal teeth perforated bone tools, some marine shell perforated stone tool, and another that is consists of ostrich eggshell beads associated with fresh water. Shells. So these are the same ostrich eggshell bead that we see, in fact, at the same time in India, but a bit later, and also this time in Africa. So when you try to do some statistical analysis with that, you see that, in fact, the first tradition, the one similar to Siberia, is present in China between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, and the other take over, so they are partially overlapping, and so they mostly produce ostrich eggshell bead until the end of the Paleolithic. Now we have a good database, georeference database for all the personal ornament from Europe between 45,000 and 24,000. And now in these very months, we are enlarging this database to cover the whole Upper Paleolithic. And we already conducted a number of statistical analyses. The last one was published in the Journal of Behavior last year. In some cases, you also have some very original personal ornament, like these guys in Shiyu, this sort of big button made of graphite that is quite unique in the Upper Paleolithic. But this is to say that at some stage, this database that we are building should ideally cover the entire Eurasia, and this may be used with appropriate statistical analysis also, not only to explore degree of connectivity, but also to compare it with the genetic variability. So, of course, the external symbolic storage is also important, and the earliest abstract engraving has not been found in Africa or in Europe, but in Asia. Is a freshwater shell coming from the site of Trinil that we have studied some years ago, and is dated 540,000 years. We have similar engravings in China, but a bit more recent. And the first figurative art, also we know, is not coming from Europe. It's been found in Indonesia at a number of sites, and these are dated to at least 45,000 years ago. For long, we believe that the earliest 3D carving was associated with the origination in Germany, but now we know that we have a similar 3D representation from Denisova, which is not published yet, but may be dated around 40,000. And we don't have anything similar in China up to 14,000 years ago. At the site of Linjing, this is the little bird that you see on the right. So this is the first 3D representation known in China. And we have analyzed this object, and this object shows an incredible mastery. It's a masterpiece in spite of being just 1.5 centimeter long. The craftsman produced more than 45 different facets produced with different techniques to make this object stand. So it's the only Upper Paleolithic object, in fact, stand on a pedestal. So we don't know whether this was just an independent invention or the long evolution of a tradition, or which we are missing many, many steps. A last word about the cultural transmission. So cultural trait to be effectively transmitted need adapted mode of cultural transmission. And we have created a theoretical grid that allows to characterize different modes of cultural transmission in the Paleolithic, exploring 3 different dimensions. The spatial dimension that, let's say, capture the proximity and complicity between the learner and the teacher, the temporal dimension that try to characterize the modularity and chronology of the information transfer, and the social dimension, which in fact indicate the degree of selectivity in the transmission traffic. And we have recently applied these criteria to 103 cultural traits emerging in human history between 3.3 and million years ago and 10,000 years ago. And we have identified a shift since 3.3 million in a more and more complex way of transmitted information, which probably, probably a shift around 200,000 with cultural traits that need verbal communication to be transmitted. But this is, so we have now a rough timeline for the evolution of cultural transmission, but this is a sort of global timeline. So I think it would be interesting to try to see how in different regions of the world and how different cultural trajectories, in fact, develop these different modes of cultural transmission. So I quickly moved to some conclusion. So my conclusion is that we need, perhaps we know we have it, but I think we need to create a science of cultural connectivity to understand how innovation emerge and spread in deep time. And culture must be seen as independent from fossil species, able to cross genetic and population boundary. And just to summarize what I said here, I said there are a number of issues that we can tackle. For example, the emergence of cumulative culture type 1, cumulative culture type 2, which is clearly have a very important implication for the evolution of culture. Niche expansion as a key defining feature of our lineage, and also how epistemic niches, when they emerge and how they develop. I mentioned a number of possibilities, as well as in being interested into the evolution of cultural transmission strategies. And I finish here by thanking you for your attention, but also thanking all the colleagues of mine who have been working with me. As you can see, many Chinese colleagues, and you will see that there is still space in the slide for many other photos of colleagues, so I really hope that the Silk Road Initiative will help me to establish new collaboration. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Francesco, a quick question, only a quick question.
Thank you, Francesco. I have a question, I don't know if it's a double question, but I have to ask it. So, do you think there's a connection, potential connection to biology and the genetics? Sorry, I mean, for example, selection for particular behavioral, since we have, now more and more complex traits, behavioral traits, anything from even things such as schizophrenia, which is not a trait, to complex trait. Do you think that these cultural, I don't want to go into Lamarckian, but do you think there's some kind of a connection? I mean, guessing, of course, in between the genetics, something may have changed, like has been suggested. And if so, do you think it may have happened regardless, again, during the Neolithic, maybe? Or do you think it was just this one of?
I think the meaning is already since the time of Cavalli, Sforza, and Feldman, we know that there is a dialogue between genetics and culture. So one can certainly, the two things are related. But in order to investigate this issue, instead of assuming that a culture of the past is linked to a human type, I think the best way is to try to format archaeological data in a way that can be independently compared with genetic evidence. So this is a bit what we try to do with the personal ornament. The good thing with the personal ornament is that you can code it by presence-absence. So in a sense, you can use exactly the same type of software and approach that you use with genetics, and you can compare matrix to see to what extent the cultural variability is in fact also, and in fact with the paper we published on degradation, we saw that there was a relatively good agreement between the genetic data that we now have for degradation, but they are still quite small in with the variability of the personal ornament, with the good aspect with personal ornament that personal ornament cover a very large area of Europe for which we don't have one single sequence. So but I mean, this is the way I will do it. So not just assuming in the beginning there is a correlation, but try to investigate with similar methods.
Thank you very much. And now I invite the second speaker, Xinyi Liu.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me. Okay. Thank you. I wanted to start by thanking the organizers from various institutions contributing to putting together such a wonderful program, which I enjoy every bit of it so far. I'm looking forward to the next couple of days. What I'm going to do today, I want to invite you, I want to draw your attention to another meeting that happened 24 years ago in a similar scale at University of Cambridge. This is a meeting organized by Colin Renfrew and Peter Bellwood at the McDonald Institute, 2001, 24 years ago. So in many ways, this is a group of people, and a particular discussion triggers and defines the intellectual space that we are discussing, particularly in the context of transgeneration discourses and initial context of various people in different environments across the Neolithic. So as I say, they were debating and particularly examining this particular idea, the so-called, now remembered as a farming language dispersal hypothesis. For those of you familiar with the archaeological community, you see a range of influential figures. So you have the late Colin Renfrew there, Peter Bellwood, the late Alfred Bayosef, David Harris, Graham Barker, Martin Jones, Jan Renfrew, Dorian Fuller, so on and so forth. So this is a group of people kind of defining the intellectual space in the next 20 years, which is useful. By the time they are discussing the discourses, the knowledge of various elements of archaeology evidence are pretty limited. So 24 years later, it's timely to return to the particular question itself. And also I see this as the starting point of my own academic career, because a number of them, I remember when I first arrived in Cambridge, the memory of this meeting was still vivid. So let's be clear about the hypothesis. So the group of people was particularly talking about this so-called farming language and migration dispersal hypothesis, which asking this question: why is the case certain archaeological evidence concerning language, agriculture, and migration seems to mingle with each other, forming certain geographical patternings? And this is the case. Why? What kind of archaeology, what kind of historical processes will form that? And above all, why is the case among the thousands of languages we are speaking today, there are few powerful languages sort of spoken by millions of people and forming cross-continental discourses where others remain regional scale? The hypothesis suggests that three things come together, and this is what Colin Renfrew and Peter Bellwood predicted, that in the next 20 years, with archaeological science and scientific methods gaining momentum, we will see certain archaeological evidence, particularly three lines of archaeological evidence: the linguistic informed phenology and archaeology informed distribution of the farming and the migration will come together to some way. This is because the whole driver of this was the Neolithic expansion of farmers. So with the Neolithic expansion of a farming population to bring farming technology as well as a language to other parts of the world. I want to remind us that this was a question, and it was a meaningful question 20 24 years ago, and we should not take that as something as granted. And now we are in a much better position to reevaluate the question itself. So this is what I'm going to do. I want to summarize a couple of the major developments in the last 20 years, and allowing us to return to the initial question and evaluate the productivity of that question itself. And as I say, we should take it as a question rather than something as granted. An early form of this question is what's now remembered as the so-called Proto-Indo-European problem. It's a very old question. So coming from, since the 16th century and 17th century, variety of scholars realize this is a problem, but it's really William Jones in the late 18th century pronounced the problem, who suggests that perhaps the similarities and the commonality of a variety of languages between India and Europe, including Sanskrit and Ancient Greek and Ancient Latin, could come from a common source. And he suggested that Celtic and Gothic are also included in this family. The chronology over there is important because this is something suggested. This is one of the oldest questions, predate modern anthropology and modern archaeology by almost a century. So something has been proposed in late 18th century, but nevertheless will only scratch the surface of a meaningful solution at this point. Later, as we know, that the linguistic problem eventually evolved into an archaeological problem. So if it's the case that there was a common group of people spoken the so-called Proto-Indo-European language, where and in what environment, what culture context we could find them. In the later part of the 20th century, there are many different hypotheses, and two permanent hypotheses can be summarized, can be visualized by the distribution of a present-day Indo-European language. So you have the difference between Colin Renfrew's so-called Anatolian expansion, Anatolian hypothesis, and Maria Gimbutas's idea of Coogan hypothesis. So Colin Renfrew's idea is pretty straightforward. He was basically saying, if you look at that map of the present-day Indo-European language, the conjunction of the two wings is a sacred place in the archaeological context. That's Anatolia. So it must be the case with the expansion of an Anatolian farming population and their farming system, given the rise of the Proto-Indo-European language. And then later you have Maria Gimbutas basically suggesting we need to pay attention to the Bronze Age. And what if this phenomenon is a Bronze Age phenomenon, then we want to pay attention to the Green Eras, which is shared during the 4th and 3rd millennium BC, shares a great deal of material similarity. Back to 24 years ago, I think it's fair to say the Anatolian hypothesis was more powerful, but increasingly scholars are convinced by the certain historical truths in Maria Gimbutas's hypothesis. As I say, 24 years ago, there was a considerable momentum in understanding the taxation of different family groups. But the discussion, the hypothesis, was predating the actual data collection. And the two major line of evidence, archaeologically informed distribution by agriculture and the genetic informed migration dynamic was not there. So the question was a predate data collection, but nevertheless inspired a variety of institutional development. And in the last 10 to 15 years, we see significant momentum in understanding that's the other two elements of the equation, the spread of agriculture and the migration dynamic. So now we have there has been a variety of audience in varieties of scholars in this audience contribute significantly in the recent momentum in understanding the trans-Eurasian movement of agriculture. One way to think about it is the whole kind of trans-Eurasian movement during the 3rd and 2nd millennium BC is eventually driven by the interaction of two agricultural centers, the Southwest Asian hilly flanks of the Crescent, and what is going on in East Asia, in China. So you have by the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, about 3,500 years ago, you have sort of evidence of cultivation of wheat and barley originating in Southeast Asia in the Yangtze River and Yellow River region. And now it's well documented the Chinese millets, particularly Panicum miliacum, Brunco millets, spread to Europe. And this is also the time you have the globalization process of variety of technology, including domesticated animals and metallurgical traditions and so on and so forth. I remember that when I started in Cambridge, Colin Renfrew was saying, Xinyi, your role is figuring out the Chinese agriculture system and how they interact with the rest of Eurasia. To some extent, after 20 years, we contribute significantly to that knowledge. Not only during the third and second millennium BC, you have a major distribution spread of agricultural tradition, but also they cross some of the invisible lines, some of the major culture filters across Eurasia. And one of them is this idea of a Hu Huanyung's line, and this is well known by the Chinese colleagues, the Chinese scholars. The idea is really simple. So basically saying, if you draw a line between two cities, Mohe in the north, bordering China and Russia, and Tengchong in the south, bordering China and Vietnam, you divide China as well as Asian China into a variety of meaningful ways. Up until today, about 95% of the population living on one side of the line, only 5% of the population living on the other side of the line. This is also meaningful division of the topography. So you have the mountainous terrains to the west as a result of uplift of the Himalayas, and you have the alluvial plain optimal for agriculture to the east. This is also monsoon and non-monsoonal division. In the archaeological context, I think it's quite interesting to think this is also a meaningful division of the Neolithic cultures and the Bronze Age cultures. Majority of the Chinese Neolithic situated on the to the east of this line, were a group of powerful Bronze Age cultures connecting with Inner Asian mountain corridors to give the rights to the west of this line. So lots of my research is a kind of a focus on the third and second millennium BC, eventually the interaction of the two systems separated by, you have two different creatures, different Neolithic systems interacting and rearticulating with each other. Not only domesticated animals and plants, but also very different culinary traditions, different symbolic and aesthetic traditions. So you have the question of, with the movement of animals and plants, how the local and the indigenous value and the cultural system could respond, and what are the possible evidence of local adaptation and cultural transformation, which is connected with the comments made by the previous speaker. So as I say, 24 years ago, the two crucial line of evidence in the language farming dispersal hypothesis is missing. We don't really have a good picture of a distribution of agriculture in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, particularly across the central environment of Eurasia. And we didn't really have the genetic informed evidence of migration dynamic. I guess we will hear a great deal from the next two speakers. But anyway, I want to draw your attention to, business is booming in terms of Asian DNA and the genomic informed migration. I want to draw your attention to a pair of papers published about 10 years ago, which initially, that's the first way of transforming our understanding of the population dynamic, particularly in Europe. I'm humbled by the audience. I'm not going to talk about the European Neolithic and Bronze Age in front of this audience, but I want to draw your attention to one of the major difference and the major divergence between the European Neolithic and the Bronze Age and the Chinese Neolithic and the Bronze Age is the present and the absence of the migration dynamic. So what this research really tells us, in each of those transitions from the Mesolithic to Neolithic, from Neolithic to the Bronze Age, we're not only looking at changing cultures, we are not only looking at changing subsistence mode, but actually there are new people moving in the case of Europe. And this is drastically different from what we have seen at the moment from the DNA evidence in East Asia. My own view is that the relationship between the hunter and foragers and the farmers, and later with the pasture, much more ambiguous in the case of Asian China. The same group of people move back and forth between different subsistence modes, and they very happy coexist with another group of people which is genetically not different from the same valley or from different peak. So although we use the same terminologies, defining those chunk of the time, Neolithic and the Bronze Age, in both Asia and Europe, but I think there is an opportunity for those of us working in China particularly, and as well as working in Europe, realizing that the conceptual differences of those terminology we are using, particularly in the case of Neolithic transition and the Bronze Age transition. And we also know that the European dynamic, for example, there were two major waves of migrations. First associated with the Neolithic Anatolian expansion, and later perhaps with the Yamanayan Cold War expansion. But in each of the cases, you do look at major movement, and some of the scholars, some of the colleagues are suggesting very different social conditions underpinning those migrations, which I don't have time to talk. Let's zoom out and come back to the bigger picture of the dynamic of Eurasia. As I say, there's a whole line very important, and much of the Neolithic, much out of the interactions between Neolithic and the Bronze Age cultures that happened across the whole line. There's very similar ideas in the European historical narrative, the so-called Zhuang Hagino line, which is a Hungarian-British historian. Similar idea, if you draw a line between St. Petersburg, Russia, antiquities in North Italy, it divides Europe into different parts, and much of the Bronze Age and Neolithic interaction during the 4th and the 5th millennium happened that way. What I'm trying to say, and also I will bring my map showing the spread of agriculture. If you pay attention to for example, the expansion of the hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent, the blue areas, the western movement of the hilly flanks crops from Anatolia to Europe, in some ways it can be understood in the context underpinned by migration. It is the case that during the early Neolithic, there were people moved to Europe from Anatolia. And then yet the second wave of migration with the Yamanayan Cold War expansion, the interesting thing is it kind of didn't transform the European agriculture system once again. And this is exactly the time when the Chinese agriculture was revolutionized, was transformed by the introduction. So it's an interesting dynamic with a lot of people moved to Europe. Maybe the way in which agriculture was organized was slightly different. There's reorganization and rearticulation, but we didn't see a second wave of agriculture revolution during the Bronze Age. Where if you look at the moment, it seems to suggest that there's an eastern movement of Yamanaya, but never really reached whole line. So between the central part of China, between two parts of China divided by Hulan, we didn't see massive scale of migration during the Bronze Age, at least during the 3rd and 2nd millennium BC. In this time period, you have agriculture moving to both directions. So what I'm saying is, if you return to the question 24 years ago, we start to see a lot of regional differences in how these things are packaged with each other. In some cases, migration packaged together with agriculture. In some cases, they are implemented by culture learning. And speaking about the dynamic of a whole line, and this is something, this is somehow resonate with the previous talk, and my own view is what you see during the 2nd millennium BC is the eastern movement of Western technology as well as Western domesticated plant and animals was transformed by the indigenous and Neolithic Chinese cultures, was transformed within the indigenous value and the symbolic system. And there are a variety of examples. So for example, the eastern movement of wheat and barley did not really bring the Western culinary system, which is based on gradient baking, to Asian China, but rather wheat and barley was folded into the Chinese culinary scene, featuring boiling and steaming. Similarly, the eastern movements of cattle, for example, was transformed to a within the household economy. So cattle in the Lhasa Plateau during the second millennium BC was no more a pastoral animals, but rather people used the same way treating pigs for thousands of years and dealing cattle in that way. And another well-discussed example is the transformation of the bronze cultures. If you think about the cross-Eurasian during the 4th and 3rd millennium BC, the bronze metallurgical tradition, it was geared up with a power display, but geared up with a power display often presented in the weaponry scenes. And once it's introduced to the Chinese, it becomes pottery, it becomes sort of pots and serving vessels. The same typology people use for thousands of years in the Neolithic. So the bronze technology was folded into that the ritualistic feasting Neolithic tradition in China. So in some ways, I don't have time to expand the title, but in some ways, I think at least in the 3rd millennium BC, the Chinese culture, the Asian Chinese culture was a non-axial culture sphere, very different from later what Jakesberg talking about the axial age, so on and so forth. All these, together with a lack of tangible evidence suggesting massive migration, at least not in the scale of Yamnaya and Anatolian, between these two regions, seems to suggest that this was a process of cultural learning and technological inspirations. As I say, the conference, similar scale of our conference today, 24 years ago, triggered a seriously interesting question. But we should remember the hypothesis was a general hypothesis, a general question, and we shouldn't take it as granted. And 24 years later, we can learn from the recent developments of archaeology. I make three, and this is my final slide. I make three observations. And the first observation is this major divergence between European Neolithic and Bronze Age and the East Asian Neolithic. The transition to Neolithic and Bronze Age cultures in Europe was underpinned by diaspora dynamic. And that is not the case in East Asia. And my own view is much more ambiguous relationship between hunter-gatherers and farmers throughout the Neolithic. The second observation is expansion of agricultural traditions across the eastern sector of Eurasia. I'm particularly talking about the 2nd millennium BC, Inner Asian Mountain Corridor and Yellow River region. Although we see the movement of agricultural traditions both directions, we didn't see. So that was not driven by migration, but by technology inspiration and the cultural learning. And the third point, if you return the original form of the hypothesis, 3 lines of evidence coming together, language, farming, and migrations, now we see a lot of regional diversities and within the context of trans-Eurasian discourses, at least we see 3 different models. You have an Anatolian model, so that's a movement of the people bring agriculture system to a new environment. And you have the Yamnaya Cold War model, massive migration for people, but nevertheless it did not transform the subsistence mode once again. And then you have the East Asian model. There's no agriculture dispersal was not underlined by, at least from the current evidence that suggests. The next speaker may provide additional insight. I'm happy to change my perspective if that's the case. So in some ways, the hypothesis proposed in 2001 can be approved at the regional level, but at the global level, there is no universal pattern can be falsified. But they were run in a very interesting way, because this is one of the questions trigger a variety of institutional development that inform our observations today. Thank you very much for your attention. So we don't have time.
No question? Ah.
Thank you. Next, so some of it just continues from you, so it's perfect. I just wanted to say one thing maybe, that I was in a conference as a PhD student 2 years before that, in 1999 in Cambridge, also with Colin Renfrew and Cavallis Forza and all these people. And I think that one interesting element that I remember as a student was the arrogance of the geneticists at the time, like they just thought they can solve everything with modern day mitochondria markers, I mean, and Y chromosome, and they thought, you know, that every question about the Neolithic can be resolved without archaeology. They even said, we don't need you anymore. I was showing my poster and I said, it's not, I mean, so maybe, you know, it's another thing to discuss, you know, later on about sort of like to what level are we really in completely different situation, or are we still having to sort out like the archaeology, genetic language? I mean, are we really there, or is it still, you know, or is it still not so clear?
Well, that's interesting. That's my view. That's my view of the original question itself. And for a very long time, people take it not as a hypothesis or not as a question, as a granted or as a position to defend. And I think that's a wrong attitude. And we should return to the original form of the hypothesis, treat it as an original question. I was reading the proceedings recently and appreciate both Colin Renfrew and Peter Bellwood and all the authors was treating this. There was a really debate about what this is. I think this is a good example. I sometimes think about the quality of the questions. Those questions do not necessarily bring a meaningful solution are always the best question. The question can generate additional questions. This is one of them. So the question generates meaningful cross-disciplinary collaborations and meaningful development in the 20 years. But nevertheless, the initial solution was perhaps wrong, but wrong in a very interesting way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then the second speaker, Ron Pinhasi.
Okay. I just need the pointer, maybe.
It is here, and this is for the red point.
Just the red point, the top?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So, how do I shift this? Okay, so I'm kind of picking from the last one, which is perfect, and then passing it to Michael to continue. So it's a perfect time. I'll do my best. I mean, I'm just, so that was my background too, since my PhD about agricultural transitions, and I just kind of go back in time. And the questions that were asked actually when I was doing my PhD, let's say about 98 to 2003, were the same kind of questions, such as how many dispersals, local transitions or not local transitions, was there a mixture between hunters and farmers, and as the genetic came in, we start asking questions such as what is the demographic histories of these expanding groups, where they originated from, and then even gone further into sex bias pattern and ancestry understanding. But it's clear that these questions pertain, on the one hand, to any region where there's hunters or, let's say, indigenous populations and expanding agriculturalists, but most likely they're not going to be the same answers, right? Because it's going to vary. And so just going into our paper together, first with David Reich and with Jan Mathiesen in 2015, and that was the paper that was, I'll show in a minute again, the other two papers, but showing what I think was the most important was this, you can see it over there, was that we managed to sample Western Anatolians and Neolithic, and we managed to show, this is just one result, which is a principal component analysis, that the Western Anatolian Neolithic are falling right into this, let's call it a cline or whatever, of Neolithic Europeans from different periods, rather than falling out of it. In the background, what you have in the, on the background and the gray is the modern populations. On the east is, on the arc is the Near Eastern and so on, and also some of the Arabian populations and so on. On the background in the left, where all the colorful dots are the European populations. And what you can see as you go further up is this transition. So we already detected, and we were not the only ones, that something's happening in Europe, and after doing the late Neolithic, middle Neolithic, and Neolithic, you have, and later on Bronze Age, you have this step incursion, and so you have a change. And what you see on the left side, this arc of groups are the hunter-gatherers that are actually also clinal. They're also varying. That's why you got this big variation, but they're still all falling left. They're falling where, right? And so we also noticed already a sex bias, some sex bias in the Yamnaya, what we call now Yamnaya expansion, male-oriented, more male than female. So that was kind of one thing to notice, right? Then a year later, we published this paper, in which case we focused on trying to get, maybe, I don't know, maybe the first time or not, but we managed to get DNA from Natufians, and we managed to get DNA from early Neolithic PP&B populations, such as Engazal, but also on the top right, you see also Ganjdare, that you all know of, goat domestication, goat herding, and what was amazing about it was that we sort of discovered on the bottom, you can see that the Natufians, which are like the first sedentary populations in the Levant, already are precursor also genetically to the pre-Proto-Neolithic B at least. I mean, we don't have A, and they're also associated, affiliated, I would say, in terms of ancestry with populations to North Africa and other regions, right? And what you see clearly is that the genetic position of Ganjdare here versus the genetic position of the Natufians and the PP&B is completely different. Hope it's not me, okay? It's completely different orientation. And what it tells us is, first of all, that we have a huge amount of genetic diversity. We didn't expect it to spread out even more, because we had this big spread, you can see different corners. And also you have massive isolation or difference as far away as possible between Ganjdare and the Natufian, suggesting no gene flow whatsoever. Okay, so that means that whatever happened in Ganjdare, if it was a Neolithic transition, it was not involving people moving from one place to another. It happened, genetically speaking, I'm careful, genetically speaking, independently, right? And by the way, as you go to the later period, like Bronze Age, these kind of distances collapse. They're getting smaller because these isolated populations start to mix, so they kind of mix, they get more into the middle, okay? So this is the paper with Michael too, like on 2019 on the Asian, which I'm going to talk about. And what is important on this slide, because it's just a nice summary slide, you can see these big colors, but if you look carefully, you see that the 1 digit is showing you declinal patterns. And this clinal pattern, I think, as far as I can tell so far, after all these years in genetics, is always the case. You always have hunter-gatherers forming clinal patterns. Why? I think because first, they're in small groups, they're never in big populations. Second, they're highly mobile. Third, they're having mating networks over extended long distances, which by definition will mean no isolation and will create a clinal pattern over very large distances, right? And when you move into the Neolithic, which is the number 2, you start seeing different patterns. It might also look clinal, but it's not so clinal. It's actually sort of statis, flux. Statis, flux. It's not necessarily just going over distances, right? And so now these 2 papers, you already mentioned them, so I don't have to go over them too much. These were the 2 big papers in 2015. One is by showing more or less the same results. One by Hack et al., showing the evidence of the, let's call it Yamnaya or steppe migration from the east into the west. That was very nice, because the same year, very close in time, came the paper by Allentoft, right, showing the same thing. So that's good science. That's all fair enough. But what was interesting in the Allentoft paper was that there was more data from the east, further east, away from the western pattern, right? So you can start seeing the pattern of relatedness to Afansievo and the Yamnaya expansion, not only west, but also east. But what exactly is happening east? They start touching on it, but it was, in a way, just the beginning, right? What was exactly happening eastwards, again, is less clear than what happened westwards. Okay, in the paper that we had this year in the European, I don't want to talk too much about the Indo-Europeans because I try to stay away from languages in this talk, but I just like to point again that, you have the Caucasus Lower Volga Klein that we discovered, or not discovered, figure out another piece in a puzzle, perhaps, showing evidence that the Caucasus Lower Volga is actually the populations that formed the Yamnaya. Yamnaya is formed by these populations across this arc of Volga when they go west and meet with the Dnieper hunter-gatherers at the time, together to form the Yamnaya, and then the Yamnaya is spreading further. Of course, another question is what happened to this CLV or whatever when they go to Anatolia. That's more complicated. Some of it ends up with the Hittites, and that's another piece of the Indo-European puzzle, not the last one, and always going to be in debate, but still an important, I think, step towards understanding the transition of the Indo-Europeans genetically, of course, speaking. But let me go back to the agricultural and Bronze Age migration. So what we see here in this map is some of the processes that you discovered, and some of the other processes I put question marks because we don't really know exactly. Now, of course, we know some things, we'll see, but as you can see, we have a bias. We have a bias that we focus so much in the left, in the west, and so little in the east, right? I mean, some of the papers, such as the one we had over here, and other team also in Southeast Asia, we got a bit of it. Very small number of individuals, like literally a dozen, less than a dozen. Same thing in the Amur Basin, we have local continuity. What seems to be a Neolithic transition, but then I don't know if it's Neolithic. It's pottery, maybe it's hunter-gatherers with pottery. And the same story from this paper by Zhu et al. Talking about botany this time, so it's nothing to do with genetics. Again, many errors based on key archaeological sites along this line, but what do we really know about what exactly happened with these arrows? What are some of these arrows? Are these arrows trade? Are these arrows what kind of trade? Is it crops? Is it metallurgy? Is it people? Is it livestock or not with livestock? What exactly happened? How often did it go from both directions or from one direction is not so clear. And then in 2019, going back to the same paper, we had this massive paper with Michael too on various sites, and one of them was the detection of the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex in terms of not detection, but managing to work. And so most of the paper focused actually on South Asia and what happened in South Asia, but part of the results also had some impact on the Inner Asia and in this case on the BMAC. And one thing that we saw that was very interesting was evidence in the case of BMAC of a lot of variation, outliers. So suddenly we see a lot of outliers. So what are these outliers? How come we suddenly get so many outliers? That's what we're going to look at now in a minute. But going again around this area, again from the same paper, just zooming into one part, right? Anatolian ancestry. We know, as I said at the beginning, that the Ganj Dareh is actually looking like Caucasus hunter-gatherers, its own type of ancestry, is not Anatolian. But as we document the evidence all the way to the Indus civilization, we start seeing a very variable level of Anatolian admixture, suggesting that it's not only the Ganj Dareh like people that dispersed eastwards, which we know, also some Anatolian gene flow, maybe overriding them or following them later, results in this complex pattern like a tracer, right? But we don't know exactly what happened. We also see evidence, but quite late, around 2000 or whatever we start seeing evidence along the steppe, as I'm going to mention, between the central steppe and Altai region down into BMAC, and also coming from all directions, from different directions, right? So it's becoming very interesting, but in this paper, we just start smelling it, so to speak, right? And so, yeah, so again, going into what Michael surely will cover much more. In the case of Kameni Ambar, of course, in the Sintasha Cemetery, I'm going to show you in a minute, but we have a lot of what I call cosmopolitanism. We start seeing a lot of diversity, really a lot of diversity in this period, and we also see elements of this diversity in other regions. But the paleogenetic perspective, I believe, is still patchy. It's not so great. Let's not fool ourselves. It's huge areas. We only have a little bit of information. And this is a slide that I want to focus on the most, again, from our 2019 paper. And if you look at each one of these 4 graphs, each one is a PCA. In one axis is the variation in Central Asia, in average, and one in Europe. And the main take-home message here is that we get differences, right? So if you look at the case of Gunur and other sites, you can see that there's the blacks represent, or gray represents the main cluster of individuals. But look at the variation. You got variations, anything to do with Andaman Islanders to Central Steppe populations, and these are individuals at the same time, at the same site. So these are not different periods. So we have basically a lot of individuals, not just admixed, but actually looking quite genetically distinct, different from each other. And on the other hand, in Shara Sokta, East Iran, again, a big UNESCO site, lots of variations. Again, Bronze Age, you start seeing these patterns in the same site of individuals, very different ancestry. And if you go down south, again, to the Central Steppe, the same, again, you see massive variation, much less here in the case of the Swat Valley. So this kind of pattern suggesting a rise of what we can call cosmopolitanism, emerging perhaps during some period in Bronze Age, some part of the Bronze Age. Okay, and what's happening in China from what we know? So we have this paper on the Tarim Basin, and this is, again, relatively late period. I mean, relatively, of course, not for everyone. And what is interesting about this paper, you see an indication of two populations, even though the one after the other, but completely, one looks like a local transition, and one is coming from what looks like a Fancievo origin, right? And this is not our work. So it's very clear, very interesting. And when you look at the pattern of what they draw just as pie chart, I think it's really informative, because you can see on the light blue, you can see uniformity in part of the steppe, and then as you go into inner Asia, it just goes crazy. There's all these different colors, everything mixed together because there's so many different ancestors happening at the same time. You don't get that in Europe, no way, nothing like that. And again, in Xinjiang, in this paper of Kumar et al., you get the two hypotheses that they tested, let's say. One is that Xinjiang is the populations coming from the steppe into Xinjiang at this period, and in the Bronze Age, and the other one is the coming from the BMAC, from the oasis, through the inner Asian mountain corridor. And their conclusion is that both must have happened, because actually they have evidence of individuals of both ancestries, so must happen together, right? Or not together, but happening, let's say, in parallel maybe. And so in the last part, I want to talk about a paper that we worked on, just published recently, and it's got nothing to do with Asia, but that's why I want to show it. This is about antique period, and actually we covered lots of sites and populations across these areas in the period from Iron Age to antique period. But what's interesting here is that once we start looking at some of these regions, we were overwhelmed by the fact that almost everywhere, Armenia, everywhere we looked, there was lots of foreign people coming from totally different ancestries, even places that we didn't expect it, not in Rome, but in what we considered marginal areas nowadays, they're completely cosmopolitan. Look at how much variation we get in the Balkans in one period. These are all representing populations of different ancestries living in the same site, not like, or all very close to each other. And when we start mapping it in and out, like who's coming from where and who's going out, we have all these arrows, and this is for, you cannot read them, for Armenia, for different places, and you can see that there's massive movements all over the place in very large distances of people, individuals moving into different places. So we tried to model that with a forward simulation, and our question was quite simple. We said, okay, if we have this level of movement, let's assume that we have 7% of the population, of each population moving, migrating, whatever, and mixing. What will it look like after X number of generations, 20 generations forward, based on what we know from modern European standards? That was done, the work with Stanford, with Jonathan Pritchard. And the amazing result is if you look at the bottom, which is PCA of the data, simulated data, to start with, you have this diversity, 4% only admixture, it's already starting to collapse. By the time you have 7%, you got nothing. At the same time, in Europe, we still have something that is much more like this. So the only way that you can retain this level of modern day diversity in Europe, genetic differentiation, if you want to call it, is if not all the people that moved actually mix with each other. And the only explanation for that is what we can call transient dispersal. In other words, some people either forming enclaves or colonies or whatever you want to call it, or some people are like mercenaries or whatever, they live there, they don't have descendants, not necessarily mixed. Not saying that all of them didn't mix, but a lot of them didn't mix. Like, that's why we have such amazing heterogeneity. So maybe we see the same thing in Central Asia and further, starting earlier, maybe in the Bronze Age and maybe even before. Okay, so the last thing to say, just as a maybe point of discussion later on, is I think that one way to look at it, it's not connected, is to try to incorporate multi-species approach, trying to do at the same time, rather than focus on a single species every time, and focus what happened to the donkeys, what happened to the horses, and so on, try to get multi-species from each specific site, and use that information, such as herd management, and other ways to be able to put it together, much like Francesco said about the beads, to have a multi-facets of genetics and then put that together. And I think this is a time to start working and thinking this way. Multi-species, thousands of genomes, but putting it together archaeologically, right? Focus on archaeology. And yeah, and just the last thing to say is like mitochondria, as you know very well, can be, let's say, giving us a different type of perspective, which is not always the right perspective. We need that, but we need it together with the genomic data to be able to trace, for example, mating patterns. But alone, it could be giving us quite a different answer to what it was in the past. And one last thing, I guess, is identity by descent that you probably, I mean, Anna certainly knows about it, and a few other people, and Michael. But this capacity to detect pieces of DNA, let's call it fragments, to be able to actually trace fragments, it gives us the capacity to do network. And these networks can be done now not only for humans, but for dogs, for cattle, for pigs, for any other species. And if we start doing them, we cannot get it wrong. We will start mapping things, just like the ornaments, and being able to actually trace and understand how species hybridized, when did they hybridize, what was the size of the herds, what distance did herds move actual connected in how many generations apart, and so on. So in summary, agricultural dispersals, it's very much like what was the talk before. It's kind of summarizing your summary. And so they vary, they not mirror the ones in Europe, that's for sure. The process of dispersal across Inner Asia and beyond was, I call it multifaceted and complex, and yeah, not clear yet whether it was a combination of innovation, cultural, sure, I'm not saying no, but it certainly was not the one that happened in Europe, and certainly it varies a lot, and we have to start only to begin to unravel this information together with more data, and I suggest more data for various species, and also cover the gap to some level that still exists, especially for the Neolithic, for this vast area between Western China and all the way to East Iran, right? And yeah, and so it certainly was not just a cultural diffusion or one or the other, and how the evidence of cosmopolitanism, I wanted to point it out as a thinking element for the future about when did it happen, why is it happening the way it does, because in Europe it's so overwhelmingly starting in the Iron Age, but not before, or late Bronze Age, and before we just really don't see that. So what exactly is happening is still something to think about, and a multi-proxy approach can be maybe a promising direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Quick question?
Maybe I return the favor to ask you a question.
Okay.
I really enjoyed the talk, and I particularly enjoyed this multi-species dynamic. Of course, once you start thinking about the multi-species, then you have environment-specific patterning emerging, because the different species adapting to, I mean, the recent paper suggesting the eastern distribution of a cow and their hybridization with the original East Asian aurochs and the later yak, so on and so forth. So you have not only multi-species, but environment-specific adaptation questions emerging, which I think is really interesting. That's what we should move towards, not only sort of looking at the geographical patternings of large-scale movement, but asking environment-specific and species-specific functional related questions.
Yes, that's exactly what I start writing my project about. So that, I mean, selection scans and doing multiple, parallel selection scans, right, on humans, because then if you have adaptation, for example, for heredity or for pathogens, such as their Synapsis paper that was excellent of, Christina Werner and so on, that found Y. pestis in sheep. So you start testing for potential parallel adaptations. And if you go another further and do it in paleoepigenetics, which we start doing in humans, then you really might have sensational results, perhaps, about whether some changes are parallel in the same regions, and then you can deduce that it's connected to diet, maybe because they had the same diet, such as millet, humans and fodder or so on, or climate change that affected several species. So several species perspective can be, I think, very good foundation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Michael Frachetti.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to the organizers. I'm delighted to be here. It's been 30 years since I've been in Budapest, so it's been a lovely chance to come back to such a gorgeous city, to be in a wonderful space, and to commune with such fantastic colleagues. I'm going to build on the previous two papers. Thank you for saving me 1 hour of lecture. I'll show a couple of details, but I also want to move beyond the prehistoric period and to transition us into the historic period, because of course the Silk Road itself is something that we, as a conceptual or metaphorical thing, is something that spans from its early stages in prehistory, of course, into its apex in the historic period. So I'm going to touch on two features of the Silk Road as a metaphor. One is its network framework, the notion of the Silk Road and connectivity as a network. And the second is that of hubs or nodes, i.e. places like cities or towns. And in fact, my own research trajectory has followed much of what the previous papers have touched on, from that into the study of urbanism and the rise of Silk Road cities as parts and connectors within networks that also relate to nomadism, or pastoralism. So it's kind of a long journey for me intellectually to bring you this, albeit short paper. Just very briefly about the history of urbanism in Central Asia, because much of what we understand the Silk Road to be, if you look at the classic maps of it, and I'll show some of those in a minute, is a connect the dots kind of map, right? You have cities along the way, maybe it's Chang'an to Merv or to Kashgar, and then the lines connect these places. I'll of course present you a very different image of the Silk Road in a minute, but I wanted to say a few words about urbanism in and of itself. So here, for example, you see some early cities, not the earliest by any means, but certainly one of the earliest true urban centers of Gonur, a vast organized architectural center. And then, of course, its medieval companion. So this is a longevity of urbanism. This is now medieval Merv, not far away from the site of Gonur itself. So what I'm suggesting from this map is that urbanism isn't something that's new in the medieval period or new in the historic period, but rather has antecedents that go back to prehistory. But in speaking of prehistory, and you'll recognize this map from the previous lecture, albeit slightly modified, I've tried to condense a bit more information into it because I won't say more about genetics than just this. But I do want to point out, kind of to reiterate the comments that Ron was just talking about in terms of the diversity of processes that help shape social systems. For example, if you look at the blue arrow that says the Yamnaya on the one side and then the Afanasyevo on the other, this is a rapid pulse migration. This is a migration event, right? So a population, maybe a small population of Yamnaya people from the North Caucasus making a way to the Altai Mountains without stopping in between. There's very few genetic evidence to suggest any kind of slow dispersal. This was a rapid movement. And in fact, much of the genome of the Afanasyevo after they arrived in the Altai died there. In other words, this was not a scenario where the Afanasyevo were highly interactive. There was a small pressure with local populations, but there was more evidence for them not interacting with their neighbors in the Altai Mountains than the opposite. A very different process than we just heard in Europe, where the genetic influence was dominant and where it was heavily integrated. To contrast that, another process, which is labeled here down, called the IMAC climb, the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor climb, was a process by which you see a clinal distribution of genetic admixture between effectively Iranian-Turanian genomes in the south and ancestry in the north in green, which was essentially hunter-gatherer, primordial steppe ancestry. And you see that red to green cline as a slower process of population integration. So that begs the question, what is driving these different procedures? What is the nature of connectivity and networks? And what is the result of different kinds of interactions apropos lifeways and ultimately trans-Eurasian exchange? The last sort of background slide that you'll need to see, or penultimate background slide, is that of economies. If we think about the way in which economies have emerged throughout the early stages of prehistory in Central Asia, in fact, there's a strong barrier outside of the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor to farming. So while domesticated animals do spread throughout the early Bronze Age, potentially with the Yamnaya and potentially through other processes of interaction, farming is a hard line. In fact, the only evidence we have for agricultural economies is within the mountain corridor and then ultimately into China. So as discussed by Xinyi Liu earlier, this question of the relationship between interactions and economies and interactions and subsistence lifeways is one that we need to bear in mind is not a uniform process as we look at the Eurasian steppe in particular. And I would asked simply that rather than think of the rather than think of this Silk Road area as an oasis Silk Road, I would prefer that we think of it more as a mountain Silk Road. So I'll come to that point here in a minute. But actually to that point, and I think I have a pointer of some kind here. Let's see. Is this it? Oop, sorry, the other way around. Sorry. This one, okay. All right, so right here I was. Next slide. So if you look at the Eurasian steppe zone here, this sort of yellow, in fact, the only common area that links you to the south is through the mountains. This gray is effectively non-productive desert. So from an environmental perspective, you essentially are interrupted from east to west along the Eurasian steppe, from the Mongolian grasslands to the grasslands of Eurasia. You're interrupted heavily by the Altai Mountains. And in fact, the natural progression is to drive south towards along the mountains. And so when we think of the geography of the Silk Road itself, it's dominated by that geographic that geographic reality of the mountains. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So what is the point of today, of my presentation today? What I ultimately want to talk about is the oscillation or change between human interactions with their environment and human populations with one another, and the adaptations that they take on in order to solve immediate problems. So some of those problems could just simply be how to live in a difficult environment, which could be a question of economic sustainability or niche construction, as we heard earlier, right? So this question of, where do you live in a specific environment, how do you live there, this is what we think of today as sustainability, right? So as we balance the human-environmental relationship, we think, once we find a sustainable adaptation, we're in a good place, we're in this utopian status. And so earlier in the morning, we heard about Paleolithic and earlier adaptations. In fact, the first talk this afternoon by Federico, talking about the capacity to sort of adapt to certain environments in particular ways, I think falls on this side of a more utopian or let's say successful and sustainable approach. And indeed, agro-pastoral systems, the kinds of adaptive plant genetics and the kinds of animal interactions that we see developing throughout the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age would reflect moments of food security and moments of ultimate adaptation, where I think populations were doing quite well. As we rotate through this oscillation, however, we also see moments of greater risk, or let's say greater vulnerability. And I put those ones on the side of dystopian realities. And I include urbanism and technological innovation as dystopian realities, in part because they put us back into this question of falling into the trap, right? I mean, earlier we heard this metaphor of the trap, right? The trap of an urban center is that now you have to maintain the urban center. So you're out of the utopian dream of being able to produce your own food and move when the water is no longer available. When you set yourself up as a city, you're now bound by those conditions. And likewise, technology, with all that it comes with, the benefits that it comes with, also binds you to certain kinds of realities in terms of resource acquisition, fuel, and other aspects. And as those systems begin to collapse, and we do see those things fall out of effectiveness, we then see again the question of ecological sustainability and new adaptations are rotating. So there's this kind of relationship between what we see as utopian solutions to dystopian realities, and then recreating the need for new utopian solutions. And I think this is very much a metaphor for where we are today, as much as it is something for understanding prehistory. Oh, sorry, this thing's a bit slow. Okay. So today I'm going to just briefly run through two archaeological vignettes, one prehistoric and one medieval, to help illustrate some of these points and to take us through what I see as kind of the formation of the Silk Road from its earliest origins to its apex, and then to beg the question of how we actually want to characterize the Silk Road. Because I think in the ultimate, in the end of the day, let's say the final stage of our meeting and the creation of ATES, it's really not only incumbent upon us to describe various aspects of the Silk Road, but in fact to redefine what we mean by the Silk Road in and of itself. And I want to take some steps towards that right now. So to the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor. I would argue, and I think the previous two papers helped to illustrate this to a certain extent, that the earliest evidence for what we could call the kinds of east-west interactions that we characterize as Silk Road, in fact, are documented in the exchange of crops, east and west, and it dates to about 5,000 years ago. A little bit later, maybe, by a couple centuries. And these are documented at sites in an area which I've coined the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor. In other words, that domain between northern Iran and Bactria and the Gansu Corridor, this mountainous region in between, defines an ecological niche that is the first evidence for east-west exchange, where millet and wheat are found at the same location. That would be the first meeting point, essentially, for Eastern and Western commodities in prehistory. And the genetics backs it up, as well as other details. And I have longer papers and longer work on this exact topic. Just briefly to take a look at what these sites look like, these are not urban centers. These are not major nodes. These are small farmsteads, small pastoralist campsites, no bigger than this room, located high in the mountains of Eurasia. This is 1,600 meters elevation, and you can see the scale of settlement we're talking about. There's like 2 or 3 houses for every time period. Again, small scale operations, but with longevity, thousands and thousands of years of occupation with hiatuses in between. So mobile populations, broadly defined as pastoralists or agro-pastoralists, with an economy of herding as their primary way of life, augmented by small-scale agriculture. Yet, and we now have a lot of sites. The two in red stars are the sort of debut sites that brought the idea to the table. But since that time, we have a lot of sites that illustrate the Inter-Asian Mountain Corridor as a reality in the early economy of the Silk Road. And indeed, it's not only the exchange of crops. We see also influences in classic cultural forms, ceramics, metallurgy, indeed textiles. I have many, many lists of the kinds of influences that ultimately become the very commodities that define later Silk Road exchange, present in this early Bronze Age period, exchanging one to the other. And of course, the unique nature of that is that it's driven not by urban nodes in this context, but rather by pastoralists, or let's say high altitude communities without the benefit of having large urban centers. So a more sustainable model, and one that was highly mobile, or let's say more mobile than we would have expected from major lowland centers like, say, Goni or something like that. So how did this function? How does this network form amongst communities that we would otherwise have assumed were not particularly well organized? Well, I took this on as a task, and what we did was I looked at the way actual animals move in high-altitude pastures. And if you look at this picture, this is a photograph of my own, taken in 2011 in the high altitudes of Uzbekistan. And you see these animals, these sheep, these are domesticated sheep, flowing through a ravine, chewing up the grass as they go. And if you walk through these valleys with a herdsman, they'll walk you in exactly the same way. So what if we took passages through the mountains and followed not the node-to-node model of saying, how do you get from point A to point B, but rather, how do you move through environments of grassland as a pastoralist, as a person who's used to moving through mountains of grasslands? And if you do that mathematically, and this was a paper now going back 10 years almost, and you summarize those pathways of flow as you consume grassland resources, you not only produce a different mapping of the Silk Road. So this is essentially a Silk Road map. 75% of known historical archaeological sites from the Silk Road map on at a very high resolution to these red lines. But it also shows that diffuse network that we always talk about. It doesn't lock the Silk Road into these simple lines of node to node. It rather gives you the potential to have this very fuzzy boundary around mobility, and to say, maybe you move some years like this, other years like that, but generally you touch on these major nodes. And when we look at this archaeologically or historically, we see sites in very strange places, like this caravanserai at Tash Rabat at 3,500 meters elevation, directly on the path. I mean, this is not serendipity, right? I mean, these are places that are specifically selected because, and you can see in the background of that picture, 4 yurts, where modern day pastoralists are living to this day. So they're still utilizing these same environments. And in fact, this is what we see going for this main corridors of the Silk Road, this southern way. And we also heard about steppe roads. And we know that, for example, into the historic period, the exchange routes and exchange networks were far beyond just those in the mountains. So I'm not suggesting that the Silk Road is only that which is existing in the mountains. There's different roads with different principles and different networks that connected us north, south, east, and west. But when we think about the main corridors of the Silk Road, we do have to rely somewhat on this question of the Inner Asian Mountain Corridor as its prehistoric precursor. By the time we get to the medieval period, or let's say the early historic period, the archaeology of the Eurasian steppe is completely transformed. And so it's really a different, there's a lot in between, so I know I'm skipping ahead. But here, for example, we see the classic burial styles of the 6th century of Turkic nomadic confederacies, doppling the landscape, creating a very different political scenario. And this is, of course, the time period when this is essentially the rise of the Tang, and a time period when historical sources start to speak of this juxtaposition between nomadic communities and urban populations. And so it's at this time, I think, that the first notions of a node-to-node Silk Road start to dominate, at least in the historic record, right? But in fact, I want to change your viewpoints from that perspective as well, because if we look at this complex historical landscape, this is, again, a very general mapping of the 6th and 7th century political entities that would have occupied the steppes and urban oases of, major oases of Central Asia. You can see that it's a total disaster. Political disaster, right? You've got nomadic communities everywhere, you've got city-states, you've got battles. I mean, it's a complete mixture of populations pushing and shoving for power and for control of commodities exchanges as well as natural resources. So therefore, it's not surprising to see then, or shouldn't be surprising then, that nomadic populations might have been overly essentialized in their role in this relationship. But the evidence to demonstrate this has been limited until fairly recently. I want to draw your attention to these 2 sites, and I'll close the next 5 or 6 slides, I think I can go quickly, on these 2 sites that are of medieval time period, taking us from the 6th century to about the 11th century, which should help us to reconceptualize our ideas about urbanism and its relationship to nomadic populations as it shapes a veritable Silk Road. So, in 2022, I was lucky and fortunate to execute the first high-resolution LiDAR study of an urban complex in the highlands of Central Asia, of Uzbekistan. And this map is a large map. It's something like 180 hectares of territory total at 2.5 centimeters resolution. And what this provides you with is an extremely high-resolution map of a high-altitude city, one of the largest known high-altitude cities in all of Central Asia. And to give you a better sense of the architecture, because it was such high resolution, we were able to expose this model to a machine learning algorithm, which actually, because of the microtopography, was able to trace out the walls of the city. So we can actually begin to give you the architectural layout of a high-altitude city in Uzbekistan at the time when ostensibly the mountains should have been occupied by just simple nomads who were banging on the gates of lowland cities like Afrasiab or Bukhara, but instead they're building their own cities. So again, surprising us with their innovation. And what were they doing there? Very quickly, the chronology and the site complex you can see is huge. The architecture is dominant. It's planned. It's monumental in the scales of defensiveness and also just urban planning that was existing there. And you can see the systematic architectural design of this particular building, which we excavated in 2024. And inside these cities, inside these rooms, are workshops for metallurgy. So these are nomadic populations of Turks, or nomadic political entities at very least, but who were devoted to integrating their efforts into a broader economy of iron and steel trade, probably steel. We haven't proven steel yet, but we can certainly say iron. These are huge pieces of slag. We have hundreds of kilograms of slag coming out of these furnaces, and the productivity of these places is amazing. So who built the city? Why am I keep saying these individuals were nomadic? And it's kind of an oxymoron or a paradox to say that you have a city operated by nomadic polities. Well, the archaeological evidence, the actual material culture, is extremely unique in the sense that it doesn't speak to a expansive Sogdian urban structure, but rather looks very, very, let's say, Turkic in style. We even have Turkic ruins etched into the bottoms of some of the ceramics. We have knives and arrows. In fact, we have a number of different features that illustrate a Turkic ethnic quality to the population. While at the same time, we see a trade in food. Remember, this site is at 2,000 meters elevation. The growing season is 2 months. So in fact, the network of connectivity, which we characterize as Silk Road commodities, these are melons and apricots. In fact, if you go to Tajikistan today, to any market in the region, you'll find these exact same crops and exact same fruit trees, fruit crops. These are the crops that actually are circulating in the highlands as trade items to feed these cities in part so that they can exist. So in fact, the sustainability, again, this is why we move into this dystopian part of the arc, because this population, while it's churning out metallurgy for the better part of 400 years, it probably can't feed itself, right? At least at the scale that it's operating. So it requires a Silk Road network for it to actually operate. And to close, I just wanted to give you some final points about why I believe this is occupied by Turks. This is one of the few Turkic warrior burials. This is unpublished, excavated in the site, in the factory, in the metallurgical complex. And you can see this individual buried with a horse and with weaponry, so that they have arrows and swords. This is a classic Turkic warrior burial right inside the actual structure. So on top of that, we have coins demonstrating Turkic tamgas. So this is a coin found, again, at Tugun Bulak, at the site in the complex. So we have multiple lines of evidence to suggest that the city itself was constructed and operated by ostensible nomads, but clearly shaping an entire domain of Silk Road interaction in the medieval period in a way that has not yet been appreciated or has not yet been understood. So to summarize, how do both prehistoric appreciations for high-altitude nomadic populations or high-altitude pastoralists, or indeed later medieval nomadic political entities, reshape our understanding of the Silk Road? Is the Silk Road simply a market network from city to city? I would resoundingly say not only. Yes, we have urban centers. Yes, there's a reality to urban oases and their role that they play in exchange. But we also have to recognize that this network that we really want to characterize as the Silk Road in and of itself wasn't only fueled by these lowland centers. It was also fueled by this inner Asian mountain corridor, this space within which populations who have otherwise been poised historically as outsiders or as barbarians or as aggressors against the functionality of the Silk Road, instead are integral to its functionality and integral to its rise through time. So if I can leave you with any image, it's that of not the image of the violent nomadic warrior, but rather the integrated nomadic polity and the integrated pastoralist who, by the way, may have been the spark for the Silk Road in the first place by virtue of their mobility and by virtue of their occupation, or their ability to adapt to and live in areas like the mountains, which were the precursors for early agricultural economies, et cetera, outside of river oases. So with that, I'll say thank you.
invite Nicola di Cosmo.
So while we get the PowerPoint, let me say this is a very, for me personally, very important place to be. I've been in Hungary before several times. I'm a graduate of the Department of Uralic and Altaic Studies at Indiana University when Dennis Seiner, whom some of you may have heard about, was the director, so he was my teacher, mentor, and he organized many Altaistic conferences in Hungary. But I've not been here for some time. And to our Chinese colleagues who has made this meeting possible, Fei Chang Gan Xie Nimen, I won't say any more. I want to say, we have operated until now on very large time scales and very large spatial scales. So I'm going to bring back into the discussion a historical dimension, which is not so big in scale. And just to illustrate perhaps how short-term changes in one part of the Silk Road may actually have a big impact on the long-term phenomena that we observe on the Silk Road. And I'm going to bring together two concepts which have also been metaphors, the Silk Road and the Great Wall of China. The Great Wall of China, is this how we go forward? Yes. And especially the so-called Great Wall region, which is northern China. Northern China, and as many of you know, or maybe all of you know, it was unified, the Great Wall, by the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi, after 221 BC, etc., etc. But I'm going to focus about a portion and a history of the Great Wall that comes before that time, and how this history is connected with the greater history or longer history of the Silk Road. And when we talk about the Great Wall, we usually think about a place, or the Great Wall region, as a place that is important because many dynastic changes originate there. It was a place of migration, it was a place of conflict, it was a place of trade and tribute relation and diplomatic exchanges, and of course also a place of cultural exchange. Climate and human impacts can be seen on the regional ecology of the Great Wall. There is a project that with Ellen Soplaki and Jörg Lutherbacher we are carrying on to study some of these impacts. It's an area where we have mixed economies, and climate also has an impact on expansion, contraction of agriculture, as well as pastoralism. But we also have states that originate their own policies and leading to military defense construction, leading to colonization, leading to nomadic settlements, but also, on the other side, nomadic invasion, when nomadic states take the initiative, and administrative changes and so on. Now, we are not talking, when we talk about this early period, about the Ming Dynasty wall. This is not the kind of wall that you have all seen when the Ming Dynasty was trying to make the Great Wall great again, I guess, and we all know how that ended, actually. This is a different kind of wall. This is a wall that was built in the north of China by 3 Chinese states, Zhao, Qin, and Yan, at the end of the so-called Warring States period. And the period of time where these walls were built is about 100 years, between 350 and 250 BCE, and later on, these bits and pieces were unified and also expanded under the Qin and Han dynasty. So why is this wall construction important for the Silk Road? This is a question that I would like to ask you, and I will try to give an answer. And this is, of course, a work in progress. Now, these early walls appear like this today. They are They are not just walls, they are fortification systems, including bastions, roads, beacon towers, forts, barracks, and so on. And they extend in various parts of the Bordeaux region and to the north of the Yellow River as well, all the way to what is today Liaoning. They are made of stamped earth. They are fairly easy to make, in a sense. They are not very imposing, but they are, and historically they've been sort of understood as kind of a divide between two different economies, two different ecologies, two different cultures, two different types of peoples, two different types of political systems. The nomads, the pastoralists in the north, the farmers in the south. But in fact, it's interesting that these early walls do not mark a divide or a division between these two different walls. This is how we imagine them sometimes, but this is not what they were. They are in the middle of the steppes, actually. They are in the middle. They don't really mark a frontier or a border between different states or between different countries. So why were they built there? And what do they mean? Right? And this is a question that we need to ask. And why were they built during the Warring States period? The technology existed before in central China, but it's around the middle of the 4th century BCE that this technology is brought to the north. Now, if we look at the archaeology of this northern zone, we see an expansion already throughout the, in Chinese historiography, spring and autumn period, or Zhou dynasty, and later during the Warring States period, of so-called nomadic cultures throughout the Bordeaux region, for instance. These nomadic cultures were maybe agro-pastoralists, maybe nomadic. It's a mixture of different types of peoples with different subsistence patterns. But they are, especially during the 4th century, we find in this, this region here, in the Bordeaux region, we find a number of very rich burials, very rich with a lot of silver, with a lot of gold, and so on. And if we look at the geography of this, together with more traditional nomadic or northern style art, like equestrian symbols of so-called animal art, horses in particular, and also weapons. These are typical objects of the culture of the nomads in this region. Now, this is very different from Chinese culture, material culture, which we have the jade, we have the ritual bronzes, we have the silk, and even since the 1970s and even before, people have recognized a material culture divide between China on the one end and the steppe on the other, two very different type of artistic and material traditions. But something happens at the same time when these northern walls are being built. And this is very interesting. Oh, first of all, I should say, archaeology has progressed. We have many more sites. And you see, this is the wall. And all these sites are non-Chinese sites, non-Chinese burials. I'm using the word non-Chinese, it's not very accurate, but these sites belong to this culture that is not Chinese. This material culture that belongs to the pastoral nomads and is connected rather with South Siberia, with Mongolia, and further north. So we see that these walls are built in the middle, with large cultural areas that are, let's say, on the inside from a Chinese perspective, and not on the outside. So This research is even more advanced in some ways, because they even assign ethnic names which come like Rong and, oops, sorry, like Rong, Di, Hu, which are ethnic names associated with these non-Chinese peoples in northern China. And again, you can see, I'm not going to get into the distinctions between what is Rong, what is Di, and what is Hu in archaeological context. These names, as applied to them, of course, there is no burial. They say, I'm a Rong, or I'm a Di, or I'm a Hu. But they are based on typological differences. And they all come from, of course, historical records, these terms. What we find in these particular contexts, inside the Great Wall, sometimes outside the Great Wall, let's say, to simplify, we find some objects in the style of the nomads, this style that is very different from China, that is animal art, and they also like the sparkly things, like gold and silver things, in the style of the nomads, but made in China, with Chinese characters on the back of this buckle, probably, or plaque, showing some animal combat. And so these objects show that the Chinese were actually producing objects made in China for a foreign market, for a nomadic market. And we even find the molds in the state of Qin at Beikang, I think, Beikang village near Xi'an, where in the state of Qin, as I said, where these objects were produced. So we find molds, and they were producing these gold objects like that one. Zhao also produced, the state of Zhao also produced similar objects for a foreign market. And the question is, are these objects found in the graves of non-Chinese people, but made in China, evidence of trade? I mean, what do they show to us historically? If they are evidence of trade, if they are used as a currency, in other words, what were the Chinese buying? And this is where history comes in. We need to figure out what was going on in China at that time. What was going on in China at that time? I mean, it's called Warring States, so this gives you a clue to what was going on. There was a lot of war in China at that time. And what happens, especially from the 4th century onwards, is a massive expansion of armies. In one battle at Changping between Qin and Zhao, 650,000 soldiers were said to have been taken place. Most of them died, especially on the Zhao side. But it was also a time of military innovation, with one state, Zhao, being the first one to adopt mounted cavalry in the style of the nomads. So what does mounted cavalry suggest? Well, it suggests the use of horses, obviously, right? And also chariots increased a lot, and chariots, of course, also need horses. So we have a specialization in the military area with more cavalry, with more charioteers, and with especially more infantry, a lot more soldiers taking place in battles. And I mean, if you've seen to Xi'an, you have an idea of the army represented in the terracotta army of Qin Shi Huangdi, massive, massive army. Now, these armies needed to move, needed logistical support. Who provides transport? Of course, pack animals, of course, cattle and donkeys and so on. Who provides the horses for the cavalry? So these are the kind of questions at the root of this notion of why, of this question, I should say, of why we find China made nomadic products in a nomadic context, close to the walls. The Chinese needed the pastoral resources. The resources from pastoral economies that produced horses, cattle, and also, by the way, hides for the armor that they used during the warring states. Now, you have to equip 600,000 people with cuirasses and so on made of hides. You need the hides. Where do you get them? Hides were also used, of course, for the Qin army. So all of this demonstrates, in my view, this huge military expansion during the 4th and early 3rd century suggests that there must be a closer connection between China and the steppes in order to provide China with the essential pastoral resources needed to feed this military revolution that is going on in China at the time. We can bring climate into this story as well. I'm not going to insist on or to be too long on this, because also we are short of time. But everybody knows that the northern region of China, the Ordos, the Loess Plateau, and so on, is a patchwork of different ecologies and different environments, but also very sensitive to climatic variability, to climatic change, both in terms of precipitation. You know, it's on the cusp of semi-arid and not so arid zones. So, and also in terms of temperatures, all of this will be explained much more eloquently tomorrow by Jürgen Lutherbacher in the context of this project on the Ordos region. But I'm just going to say, you know, how does the climate variability of the Ordos may relate to our story of increasing commercial trade, commercial contacts between China and the nomads? And the story is maybe related to what Professor Chen, Fahu Chen, was also telling us this morning about a long-term increase in nomadic presence until 2300, I think, BP, which coincides actually very well with this period. And recent climatological work shows that, in fact, we have had a long period probably affecting the area that I'm talking about, the northern steppe zones, showing a long-term wet period from 720 to about 110 BCE. Another study here shows also a wet and warmer period in the 3rd century until the Han Dynasty. So this is a period where we might find an warmer, wetter climate that may actually favor a pastoral economy. The NPP, the net primary productivity of the steppes increases, and all of the ecological studies that I know of connect this particular climate condition and this particular increase in the biomass of the steppes with the increases also in animal production. So it is possible that a number of these nomadic people had huge surpluses of cattle, horses, and so on that they could sell to China at the time when the Chinese were engaged in this massive expansion of their armies, and they needed more pastoral products. So, all of these studies, this is just one study, but all of the studies I've seen do suggest that as soon as you get a warmer and wetter period, the pastoral production really increases exponentially. So in my conclusion, what have we seen? We've seen the construction of the walls in 4th century BC. Note, I've not suggested the use of these walls yet, because if they are not a border, a frontier against nomads, what are they? right? I'm suggesting that these walls were actually built to protect what I might consider special economic zones by these northern states against other Chinese states or against hostile nomads. There were also hostile nomads, of course, but also to protect the trade routes, where you have to carry a large herd of horses or cattle, you need to protect it, and these walls probably, possibly, might have served that function with their forts, with their garrisons, with the soldiers, and so on. So the commercial relationship was based on China's historical condition at the time, that is, the war, the warring states, the increases in military spending, the need to outfit very large armies with resources that had to come from these pastoral people. And climate conditions might have increased this pastoral productivity and provided the surpluses to sell to China. And you know that this is something that goes on throughout Chinese history. You know, this trade, horse trade, and so on, is not just isolated. An isolated episode is something that continues to be a feature, let's say, of what we might call the Silk Road. And so we could say that the greater integration of the economies of China and pastoral nomads on the Great Wall frontier was indeed a key development of the Silk Road, because after this period, we find a lot more Chinese products. The broken mirrors, the chariots, of course, the silk itself increases in volume and frequency as we find them in the Xunnu tombs and various other contexts, all the way, of course, to Siberia, Xinjiang, and even the Mediterranean later on. But so we say, you know, the historical beginning, or the beginning of the historical Silk Road is attributed to Jianqian and you know, going to Xinjiang and so on. But maybe we can say, maybe the historical Silk Road begins in 350 BCE, not in 200 BCE, because this is when the two economies really become much more integrated, and you have a lot more cultural exchange. So Great Wall, not quite yet a barrier, much more a conduit to trade and relations. Okay, this is what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the last speaker of the session, Imre Hamar, and after the coffee for the question.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy that a previous talk a little bit limited the space. Just in the previous times, I'm just trans-Eurasian, I mean, phenomena, I mean, ecological, historical, so it was really, I was really amazed to learn so much thing about Silk Road, so that's why I don't dare to say anything about Silk Road, because you know much more than I could mention. And I would like to limit the space even more to a very small place. It's called Khotan. I don't know whether those who are studying Khotan start studying the Silk Road. I mean, they all know Khotan because it's a famous place for Buddhist culture in Khotan. Myself, I'm studying Chinese Buddhism, and especially one scripture, it's called Avatamsaka Sutra, which originates from Khotan. So now I'm going to a little bit discuss this question. So, okay. So this is the famous tablet from Khotan from the 7th century. You know, it refers to the famous legend as you see the silkworms are smuggled out in the hair of the princess. So that's very, very famous. So it's just some connections between Khotan and the name Silk Road. As we know that Silk Road, its name is, many people mentioned it's not really appropriate, and we know that it was anything but Silk Road. And yet, but that Silk Road has just this word. I think it's in a way, in its poetic way, it really captures, I mean, people's fantasy and imagination. I mean, that's why this is a really useful word. That just talk show. The famous American scholar of Silk Road, Valerie Hansen, just mentioned that if we just drop this name Silk Road and we change into some more prosaic name, maybe she wouldn't be able to sell a book on Silk Road anymore. So anyway, so archaeological evidence confirms that a wide variety of goods were transported along the Silk Road. Yet it is probably that its true significance lay not primarily in commerce, but rather in the transmission of cultures, customs, ideas, beliefs, and religions. For this reason, it might be more accurate to speak of it as a road of cultures or road of ideas. It was along these routes that innovations, artistic forms, ideas, and religions such as Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, Judaism, Nestorian Christianity, Islam, and Christianity spread. Among the religions introduced from the West, Buddhism exerted the most profound influence on Chinese culture. See the White Horse Temple Luoyang, which is supposed to be the first temple in China. It became a deeply embedded, transforming philosophical thought, religious practice, and even social structures that today it is recognized as one of Chinese religions, despite its Indian origins and the significant impact of Indo-Asian mediations. Buddhism spread from northern India and Gandhara, present-day northwest Pakistan, eastern Afghanistan, into Indo-Asia during the 1st century. It remained the dominant religion of the region for a millennium until the rise of the Islam. I had the opportunity to participate in academic conferences on Buddhism in Xinjiang, and in visiting local Buddhist monuments, I witnessed firsthand how a flourishing Buddhist culture once emerged under the harsh conditions of the Taklamakan Desert. We just recently discovered a Buddhist settlement not far from Kashgar, the Moor temple. We see on the left side the remains of a stupa, and on the right picture we can see the remains of the Buddhist monasteries next to the stupa. From these, and the other one is the Yar city. It is the north of Turpan Basin. You can see the left side also the remains of a stupa, and it's amazing if you say in Yar city that the great big quarter of the city actually dedicated to the Buddhist temples, stupas and temples. From these Buddhist centers came the earliest missionaries of Indo-Asian origin, Sogdians, Parthians, Khotanese, Khitans, who likely arrived in China as early as the 1st century to begin what we call the sinification of Buddhism. Among the translators, Kumarajiva stands out. Born in Kucha, a kingdom along the northern branch of the Silk Road, to an Indian Buddhist monk father and the Kuchan princess mother, he studied in Kashmir, Kucha, and Kashgar, and soon gained renown. Emperor Yaoxing even sent troops to Kucha to bring him to court. This illustrates a broader phenomena of the time. Emperors of nomadic origin, northern dynasties, often surrounded themselves with famous Buddhist masters, believing that their wisdom and supposed magical powers could support imperial rule. Kumarajiva's greatest achievements was the creation of a Chinese Buddhist language based on classical Chinese, which became the standard for subsequent translations. During the sinification process, Buddhism entered into dynamic interaction with Chinese culture, undergoing continual adaptation over centuries. Out of this fusion emerged Chinese Buddhism, which, while retaining the Indian foundation, was also reshaped by Indo-Asian influences and local reinterpretations. It gave rise to uniquely Chinese schools, Tiantai, Huayan, Chan, and Pure Land, that had not existed in India and which became the dominant forms of Buddhism, not only in China, but throughout East Asia. This raises the fundamental questions. Since Buddhism entered China through Indo-Asia, to what extent was development of Chinese Buddhism shaped by Indo-Asian innovations, interpretations, and practices? To address this, one must first clarify the distinctive features of Indo-Asian Buddhism and whether it can be distinguished from Gandharan Buddhism, which was geographically not far removed. This is not an easy task, given the expansion of the desert and the disappearance of Buddhism from the region over 1,000 years ago. Nevertheless, we can draw on sources such as Buddhist wall paintings preserved in caves like those at Kizil, texts surviving in various languages, and archaeological findings. Jens Uwe Hartmann has examined the Buddhist manuscripts preserved along the Silk Road and found that different Mahayana sutras were cultivated there compared to India. One of the most important sutra famous in East Asia is the Vimalakirti Sutra or the Lotus Sutra. The Vimalakirti we see on the left side, it's a painting from Dunhuang, very, very famous, very popular in China. You know, Vimalakirti was a layperson, not a monk. And in the Sutra, Vimalakirti Sutra mentions that the monks surrounding Buddha just listened to the lecture of Buddhas, but many times they weren't able to grasp the meaning of the teachings. So they went to the lay people, the lay person Vimalakirti, and asked the meaning of all these teachings, what the Buddha taught. And Vimalakirti just very elegantly, very easily always explained these teachings. It means, it has the meaning that it's not necessary that somebody to be a monk to understand the Buddhist teachings. Because originally, I mean, Buddhism was a religion for monks and not for lay people. So this is why Vimalakirti Sutra is a big change, a big turnover in the history of Mahayana Buddhism. And of course, one of the most famous part of the Vimalakirti Sutra, when in one of the last chapters, I mean, Vimalakirti is asked that, what is the meaning of the final truth? What is emptiness? And Vimalakirti just remains silent, doesn't say a word. Which means that final truth, ultimate truth, finally is unexpressible. So you cannot say a word about the final truth because emptiness is something which you cannot describe by words, with words. It's very important because in many Buddhist works later this appears. Also, the Lotus Sutra is one of the most important Mahayana sutra in whole East Asia, in Japan, China, Japan, and also these two sutras, they were not so much favored in India. This may help explain why the Mahayana sutras most popular in China, the Vimalakirti Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, and Avatamsaka Sutra, were less prominent in India. Interesting meditation texts have also been discovered along the northern branch of the Silk Road. They appear to be local compilations describing visualization practices unknown in India. Later, similar texts were written in China or Indo-Asian ones were further developed, leading to the emergence of a distinctive genre, the so-called visualization sutras. One such text describes the visualization of Amitabha, which was eventually canonized as a central scripture of the Pure Land School, one of the most influential forms of Buddhism across East Asia. You can see here, it's the Japanese paintings on the left and the Chinese sculpture on the right side, Amitabha. Archaeological exploration of the Silk Road was significantly advanced by the Hungarian-born Orientalist and explorer Aurel Stein, an external member of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. During his expedition in Indonesia, Stein uncovered a forgotten world, an ancient Buddhist culture hidden beneath the sands of the desert. Thanks to his work, the history and culture and written tradition of the Khotanese kingdom, as well as its flourishing Buddhism, became known to the wider world. Interestingly, his investigations were guided by the records of the famous Chinese Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang, who had visited the region in 630, and whose accounts helped Stein identify the archaeological sites. The traditional depiction of Xuanzang, and also a picture from Tunhuang, which describes Xuanzang returning home. Khotan, known today by its Chinese name, Hetian, was primarily famous in Chinese history for its jade, carried by its two rivers, Yurungkash, white jade, and Karakash, black jade. Stein attempted to trace the source of the Yurungkash in the Kunlun Mountains, but the impassable route prevented him from reaching it. Archaeological evidence suggests that the earliest settlers were nomads of the Eurasian steppe, later joined by groups arriving from India. The Khotanese language belongs to the Iranian family, though it contains a substantial Sanskrit vocabulary. According to the historical works of the Han Dynasty, Khotan had a population of about 19,300, which seems modest compared to the flourishing Buddhist community described by the pilgrim Faxian and Xuanzang. Faxian was hosted in the Gomati monastery, which, by his account, accommodated 3,000 monks. He reported that there were 14 large monasteries and several smaller ones in Khotan. He also described a ritual procession in which the king, removing his crown, humbly approached a Buddha image barefoot, offering flowers and incense and prostrating himself before it. Despite existing in the shadow of powerful neighbors, the Chinese, Tibetan, and the Turkic Empire, Khotan managed to preserve its Buddhist culture until 1006, when Yusuf Qadir Khan of the Karakamids conquered the city and introduced Islam, effectively ending its Buddhist tradition. Among the surviving Buddhist monuments, the Ravak Stupa stands out, described by Stein as the most impressive Buddhist sanctuary he had ever seen in Khotan. The left side is Stein pictures, the right side is just my picture I took in June. By only a few years ago, reaching this site still required a camel or jeep. A modern paved road and an adjacent museum now make the stupa accessible and its excavation history visible. More recently, excavation and Toplukdong, Domoko, have revealed new Buddhist temples and shrines, corroborating earlier descriptions of Khotan's thriving Buddhist culture. These are remains of an old shrine, monastery. And here's a very small shrine, the middle Buddha statue, and we have wall paintings around it. It's beautiful. And in the Museum of the Khotan, you can see all kinds of wall paintings collected throughout Khotan. It's really worth seeing. The excavations also unearthed manuscripts in the Khotanese language, dating from different periods and thus exhibiting significant linguistic variation. Pro-Dr. Skiervo distinguishes three stages: Old Khotanese, 15th, 6th century, Middle Khotanese, 7th to 8th century, and Late Khotanese, 9th to 10th century. Most Buddhist texts are translations from Sanskrit, the earliest dating from the 5th century. The absence of earlier translation could be explained either by their destruction or by their yet undiscovered status. But Jean Nattier has argued that Sanskrit was deliberately preserved as a sacred language during the early centuries, given the closeness of Khotanese to Indian idioms. Eventually, as understanding diminished, translation into Khotanese became necessary. Here we see the Book of Zambasta manuscript in Khotanese. The most important locally composed Buddhist work is the Book of Zambasta, written in the 5th century at the request of an official named Zambasta. Of its original 298 folios, 207 survive. It is a revered collection of existing Buddhist texts reflecting Mahayana ideas considered central at the time. Taken together, these findings demonstrate that Khotanese Buddhism was not merely a transmission culture relaying Indian teaching and art along the southern branch of the Silk Road to China. It was also a site of innovation, producing original contributions to Buddhist literature and thought. Because the earliest missionaries and translators who reached China came from Indo-Asia, and because the first Chinese seekers of the Dharma, Tiufa Sangzhen, also traveled to Indo-Asia in search of texts, the region played a decisive role in shaping Chinese Buddhism. Chu Shixing was the earliest recorded pilgrim who departed for Khotan in 260 in search of the Prajnaparamita Sutra. We see the earliest printed Chinese book, which is a Vajrachedika, the Prajnaparamita Sutra from Dunhuang. Though himself died in Khotan, his disciple carried the Panchavimshatika Sahasrika manuscript to China in 282, where it was translated in 291 by the Khotanese monk Mokshala, under the title Fanquang Pozhoting, Radiant Prajnaparamita Sutra. This text had profound influence, attracted not only Buddhist monks, but also Confucian literati, who found resonances between Buddhist emptiness, shunyata, and Taoist connection, Lu Wei. For a century, until Kumarajiva's new translation, it remained a standard Chinese version. Other Khotanese translations, such as Gita Mitra, introduced key texts, including the Dashabhamika Sutra in 376, which describes the 10 stages of the Bodhisattva path. This work became the foundational for the Chinese Tilun school, and it was later incorporated into the Avatamsaka Sutra. Perhaps Khotan's greatest impact came through the transmission of the Avatamsaka Sutra. The monk Zhifaling traveled there to obtain the manuscript, which the locals were initially reluctant to release. Only after royal persuasion did he secure a copy translated into Chinese by Buddhabhadra in 420. The Avatamsaka Sutra is among the most extensive Mahayana texts, but its origin remains obscure. Surviving evidence suggests it was compiled as an anthology of independent sutras, possible in Indo-Asia, with Khotan as a likely center. Indeed, the second Chinese translation, undertaken in 699 at the request of Empress Wuzetian by the Khotanese monk Shikshananda, contains 3 more chapters than Buddhabhadra's version. We see on the left side Vairochana Buddha in the middle, and Manjushri and Samantabhadra. These are the 3 figures of the Avatamsaka Sutra. Usually, the sutra starts with the enlightenment of the Buddha, and it is supposed to be the first teaching of the Buddha, which is recorded by the Avatamsaka Sutra. It's an interesting element of this sutra that there was all the teaching of the Vairochana Buddha or the Buddha, but actually the actual teaching is done by either Manjushri or Samantabhadra or other bodhisattvas. So that's why usually is this three figure, it's called the Huayan Trinity. And on the other side, you can see paintings from Dunhuang, which shows that the nine lectures which Buddha actually delivered during the Avatamsaka Sutra. The Buddha is supposed to move 7 different places without actually moving from the Bodhi tree. And we see below, we see the lotus flower, which is the whole word, according to this Avatamsaka Sutra, actually relies on a lotus flower. From its exegesis emerged the Huayan school, one of the most influential Buddhist schools in China. Its philosophy profoundly shaped Chinese Buddhism and left lasting impact on Korea and Japan. The school's great patriarchs, Fazang and Chengguan, served as imperial teachers and advisors. The Huayan vision of the cosmos, centered on Vairochana Buddha, inspired rulers across East Asia. The Todaiji Temple in Nara, built by Japan's Kegon School, enshrines a colossal image of Vairochana that continues to inspire awe. The Huayan doctrine that the entire universe can be found in a single speck of dust, and that the one and the many are mutually encompassing, remains one of the pinnacles of Buddhist philosophy, resonating with later holistic worldview, including modern Japanese philosophy of the Kyoto school. In conclusion, while the Muslim conquest brought an end to Buddhism in Khotan, archaeological and theological research in the 20th century has ensured that its legacy is not lost. For a millennium, Khotan not only preserved Buddhism, but enriched it with original insights, passing them on to China, where they became integral to East Asian intellectual and religious traditions. Thank you.
Before the coffee break, I have to do an announcement. This session 2 will continue, but in the small lecture hall on the second floor. There are second. Oh, sorry, second. Yeah. Yeah. Second, sorry, there are 2 rooms. Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, for 15, for the coffee. 15.
Yes. Okay. So thank you so much for your nice chair. Okay, we have, because we are about half hour behind the schedule, so we have just 15 minutes of a coffee break. But for the speaker, you should upload your PPT. So session 1 is in this room. Session 2 upstairs, called small lecture room. So you go to the lecture room, small lecture room, to upload your PPT file. Thank you so much.